History books usually tell us about wars, kings, and the fall of empires. But the greatest killer in human history was not a soldier wielding a sword. It was an invisible bacterium, Yersinia pestis. The year is 1347. The place, the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa in Crimea. The Mongol army has surrounded the city, but something is decimating the besiegers, disease. And then comes one of the first biological attacks in recorded history. The Mongols begin catapulting the plague-ridden corpses of their dead soldiers over the city walls. Terrified Genoese merchants flee onto their ships, but they take with them not only their goods, they carry the very force that will bring Europe to its knees, death itself. When the ships of death finally reach the port of Messina, Sicily, the sailors who stagger ashore are little more than piles of bone and pus. What follows is the greatest catastrophe humanity has ever known. A pandemic that wiped out nearly half of the human population, humbled kings, shattered religious certainty, and, believe it or not, laid the foundations of the modern world. Today, we're going to explore that cataclysm in all its depth, the Black Death. If you're ready, we're going back to where the apocalypse began, between 1347 and 1351. The Black Death, which ravaged the known world, is regarded as one of the most decisive demographic catastrophes in human history, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This pandemic spread from the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa in Crimea to the Mediterranean basin, and from there into the heart of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, wiping out roughly 1/3 of the global population, with regional mortality rates reaching up to 60%. This report demonstrates that the plague was far more than a biological event. It was a multifaceted historical rupture that accelerated the dissolution of the feudal system, undermined medical authority, redefined the role of the state in public health, and inflicted deep trauma upon religious and social structures. Drawing on primary sources of the period, court records, chronicles, and modern bioarchaeological data, the report offers a detailed analysis of the tension between medical helplessness and innovation, the administrative responses of states, and the emergence of a new socio-economic order shaped by the survivors. For the people of the Middle Ages, this disease was God's punishment. They knew nothing of germ theory, but what were they actually facing? The Black Death was not a single illness. It came in 3 distinct forms, each more deadly than the last. Bubonic plague, the most common form. It begins when an infected flea bites a human. Then come the egg-sized, black, pus-filled swellings, buboes, in the groin or under the arm. When these ruptured, they released unbearable pain and stench. The mortality rate, 60%. Pneumonic plague, the terrifying airborne form. The bacteria infect the lungs. This was the most dreaded variant because it spread from person to person through the air. If someone coughed or sneezed toward your face, your death sentence was essentially signed. Mortality rate, 95%. Septicemic plague, the deadliest form. The bacteria enter directly into the bloodstream. Fingers, nose, lips turn black and rot before one's eyes. This is where the name Black Death comes from. Mortality rate, 100%. A person who was healthy before going to bed could be dead by morning. From Messina, the plague spread like a forest fire across Italy, France, England, and eventually to Scandinavia and Russia. Its speed defied belief. A doctor might visit a patient in the morning and be buried beside that same patient by evening. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote in the Decameron, people ate lunch with their families and supper with their ancestors in the afterlife. So how did people fight this invisible enemy? They had no antibiotics. Medical authorities, physicians devoted to the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, believed the disease was caused by miasma or bad air. According to them, the air had been poisoned by the malign alignment of the planets, especially Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. So the first line of defense became pleasant smells. People walked around with flowers and musk in their pockets. Homes were filled with burning incense, and some physicians even claimed that a worse smell can overpower a bad one, advising people to sit near latrines. This, of course, was a disastrous mistake. The most common treatment was bloodletting. Doctors believed that contaminated blood needed to be released from the body. But in reality, This only weakened already fragile patients and hastened death. Other desperate remedies included placing frogs on swollen buboes or rubbing pigeon blood on infected areas. And yet, during this dark era, an idea emerged, one that we still use today: quarantine. The Venetians and the people of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, began holding incoming ships offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni, before allowing them to dock. This was the moment when state policy stepped in where medicine had utterly failed. The plague did not only consume bodies, it corroded the moral fabric of society. Fear grew so overwhelming that fathers abandoned their sick children, and priests hesitated to approach the dying to deliver their final prayers. The idea of memento mori, remember death, took its place at the center of art and daily life. This despair produced two opposing reactions. One group surrendered to reckless hedonism, declaring, "If we're going to die tomorrow, we might as well live today," and plunged into drinking and wild festivities. The other group moved in the opposite direction, convinced that the plague was God's punishment and that only extreme piety could redeem humanity. From this belief emerged the movement of the flagellants. These men traveled from city to city, chanting hymns as they whipped themselves with barbed lashes until they were drenched in blood. In their eyes, only their own suffering could appease divine wrath. But the darkest chapter was the search for a scapegoat. Terrified populations sought someone to blame for the catastrophe and tragically turned on the Jews. Accused of poisoning the wells, thousands of Jews in cities like Strasbourg, Basel, and Mainz were burned alive. Yet Jews were dying from the same plague. Fear had simply extinguished rational thought. States were paralyzed. There were no officials left to collect taxes, no peasants to till the fields, no commanders to lead the armies. 40% of England's population had vanished. In cities like Florence, that number reached as high as 60%. So how did governments respond? Their first instinct was to preserve order, but the economic balance had collapsed. Where once laborers had begged their lords for a scrap of bread, now the lords were the ones begging, desperate to find anyone who could work their lands. For the first time in history, labor became valuable. Survivors demanded wages 3 or 4 times higher than before. In 1351, King Edward III of England issued the Statute of Labours, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. The law also forbade workers from traveling, but these regulations failed. The market power now belonged to the peasantry. This shift laid the foundations for the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 and ultimately contributed to the decline, and in many regions, the end, of serfdom in Europe. Epidemiological background and the nature of the disease. The magnitude of the shock inflicted by the plague on medieval societies was directly related to its speed and lethality. Modern paleomicrobiology and historical epidemiology confirm that the 1347 outbreak was not a single clinical entity. Rather, Yersinia pestis manifested in 3 distinct forms, appearing either simultaneously or sequentially. Clinical manifestations and transmission dynamics. Guy de Chauliac, one of the most competent surgeons of his age and physician to the papacy, was among the first medical authorities to distinguish between 2 major forms of the disease while observing the epidemic firsthand in Avignon. As detailed in his Chirurgia Magna, Great Surgery, the initial phase of the outbreak was characterized by sustained fever and hemoptysis, coughing up blood, with patients dying within 3 days. This corresponds to what modern medicine identifies as pneumonic plague, a form transmitted from person to person through respiratory droplets. The second and more widespread form, bubonic plague, manifested through egg-sized swellings known as buboes in the groin, armpits, and neck. Chauliac reported that death typically occurred within 5 days in this form. Modern DNA analyses and skeletal examinations from plague burial grounds, such as East Smithfield in London, have conclusively confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis in victims, thereby invalidating earlier alternative theories involving anthrax or viral hemorrhagic fevers. Humoral imbalance and astrological causality. Because 14th century medical knowledge lacked any concept of germ theory, practitioners sought explanations in celestial and environmental forces. The 1348 report of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Paris, Compendium, attributed the ultimate cause of the outbreak to an astrological catastrophe. the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in Aquarius on March 20th, 1345. This celestial alignment was believed to have generated poisonous vapors, miasma, that rose from the earth and corrupted the air. Medical responses between desperation and experimental treatments. Because physicians believed the disease spread through miasma, most therapeutic efforts focused on purifying the air and restoring the body's humoral balance. Yet these attempts often amounted to tragic interventions that worsened the patient's condition. Preventive medicine and environmental purification, fumigation. Since the plague was associated with foul air, aromatic substances became the primary line of defense. The wealthy carried expensive materials such as musk, amber, and aloe, while common people fumigated their homes with rosemary, juniper, and frankincense. As seen in the case of Baron von Lovell, physicians fumigated patients' rooms with dried flowers and myrrh, operating under the principle that good air would neutralize bad air. Additionally, concoctions such as thieves' vinegar and the consumption of sour foods were recommended to dry the body and counteract the moist quality of miasma. Physicians like Ibn Haddama advised avoiding southern winds and exercising only in clean air. Interventional treatments, bloodletting, and surgery. Because the plague was understood as an accumulation of toxic or burnt blood, the most widespread and controversial treatment was phlebotomy. By extracting blood from the vein or using leeches, physicians sought to release the patient's pneuma, vital force, and reduce fever. In reality, this practice weakened already dehydrated and infected patients, thereby increasing mortality rates. More aggressive measures included applying poultices made from excrement, resin, onion, and lily root onto buboes, or surgically lancing the swellings to drain the pus. Guy de Chauliac claimed he survived the disease by applying this method to himself. Theriac, the mythic antidote. Theriac, considered the pinnacle of medieval pharmacology, was marketed as a definitive cure against the plague. Originating in antiquity, this complex medicinal paste contained 60 to 80 ingredients, including opium, viper flesh, cinnamon, saffron, and fermented honey. Its medical rationale rested on the Galenic principle of like cures like, and the humoral notion of heating and drying. Viper meat was believed to confer resistance to poison, while spices counteracted the plague's cold nature. The high dose of opium did not cure the disease, but provided analgesic and sedative relief, which helped reinforce belief in the drug's efficacy. In cities like Venice, the production of Theriac became a state-regulated industry, performed publicly to prevent adulteration. Medical debate in the Islamic world, contagion theory, and Ibn al-Khatib. While miasma theory dominated Europe, the Islamic world witnessed a theological and medical conflict regarding the nature of plague. Orthodox scholars cited the Prophet Muhammad's statement, "Do not enter a land where plague is present, nor leave a land where it has struck," and the belief that plague conferred martyrdom, rejecting the idea of contagion ado. According to this view, disease occurred solely through God's will. However, Ibn al-Khatib, vizier and physician to the Emir of Granada, challenged prevailing dogma with the revolutionary stance. In his Muqniat al-Sil, The Persuasion of the Inquirer, he argued for contagion through empirical evidence, asserting that the existence of contagion is established through experience, induction, sensory perception, and observation. We see that those who come into contact with the sick die, whereas those who remain isolated survive. He further noted that nomadic populations, Bedouins, in North Africa were protected due to their isolated lifestyle, supporting his contagion theory with sociological observations. Although his ideas anticipated the foundations of modern epidemiology, they provoked strong opposition from religious authorities, and Ibn al-Khatib was later accused of heresy. 2.5. The Plague Doctor Costume, a historical anachronism. The iconic image of the plague doctor wearing a beaked mask, widely associated with the Black Death, does not belong to the 1347 to 1351 pandemic. This costume was designed in the 17th century, 1619, by Charles de Lorme. 14th century physicians did not use specialized protective garments. Instead, they carried aromatic sponges to mitigate exposure. The 17th century design reflected continued belief in miasma theory, the herbs in the beak filtering the air, but it was not a feature of the Black Death period. State policies, public health, and administrative crises. The plague pushed state administrative capacities to the brink of collapse, yet it simultaneously gave rise to the earliest forms of modern public health bureaucracy and border control mechanisms. The Pistoia Health Ordinances, 1348 early quarantine legislation. Among European polities, the Italian city-states produced the most proactive legal responses. Enacted on May 2, 1348, the ordinances for sanitation in a time of mortality in the Tuscan city of Pistoia represent one of the most detailed plague management documents of the era. The ordinances contain provisions such as travel and trade restrictions. Pistoian citizens were forbidden to travel to infected cities such as Pisa or Lucca. The import of old clothes, believed to retain miasma, was prohibited. Goods brought in illegally were publicly burned in the town square. Food hygiene and slaughterhouse regulations. Butchers were banned from displaying meat openly in their shops, and all animal slaughter and tanning, leather processing. Operations were ordered outside the city walls to reduce foul smells associated with miasma. Funerary protocols. Bodies could not be brought into the city. Graves had to be dug at least 2.5 arm lengths deep, about 1.5 meters, to contain odors, and mourning garments and bell ringing were forbidden to prevent crowds. Even family members' participation in funerals was restricted. The invention of quarantine, the Ragusa and Venice model. The concept of quarantine, quarantino, originated on the Adriatic coast during this era. In 1377, the city-state of Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, under Venetian influence, enacted the first law requiring ships and travelers to undergo isolation on nearby islands for 30 days, Trentino, before entering the city. This period was later extended to 40 days, both for medical observation and symbolic reasons. Christ's 40 days in the desert, the 40 days of the flood. The Republic of Venice institutionalized the system, establishing the world's first quarantine hospitals on the Lagoon Islands, notably Lazaretto Vecchio. Incoming goods were aired, fumigated, and inspected, while passengers were kept under observation. Quarantine thus served not only as a medical precaution, but also as an economic strategy to safeguard Venice's reputation as a secure trading port. Administrative breakdown, the Mamluk Sultanate versus Europe. A sharp divergence emerged between European and Middle Eastern responses. In the Mamluk Sultanate, ruling Egypt and Syria, plague was regarded as an expression of divine will, Qadar Allah. As a result, the state did not implement organized quarantine or urban lockdown measures. During the catastrophic outbreak in Cairo in December 1348, when deaths reached an estimated 7,000 per day, the Sultan and the elite fled the city, leaving the remaining bureaucracy to do little more than record fatalities and organize funerary prayers. European cities, especially Italian city-states, treated the plague as a public health crisis, creating administrative measures such as health boards. In contrast, the Mamluk government perceived the outbreak as an uncontrollable divine calamity. Consequently, the Mamluk economy and population recovery lagged far behind Europe. Egypt's agricultural system collapsed, irrigation canals deteriorated from neglect, and the loss of rural labor triggered a prolonged economic depression. Social consequences, disintegration, radicalism, and scapegoating. The psychological trauma produced by the plague dissolved social bonds and transformed fear into violence. Chroniclers like Boccaccio and Jean de Venette depict a society where fathers abandoned their sons and mothers their infants, illustrating the collapse of compassion under the weight of terror. Jewish pogroms and the Strasbourg massacre. As communities sought an explanation for the catastrophe, fear was projected onto marginalized groups. Claims that Jews had poisoned wells to exterminate Christians escalated into mass violence, particularly in the German lands and the Holy Roman Empire. One of the most tragic cases was the Strasbourg massacre of February 14, 1349. Before the plague had even reached the city, guilds and local nobles incited the arrest of roughly 2,000 Jews. They were executed collectively on a massive wooden platform built in the Jewish cemetery. Except for children and those forcibly baptized, the community was annihilated. Economic motive. Beyond religious fanaticism, economic incentives played a critical role. In Strasbourg, nobles and merchants who owed debts to Jewish moneylenders used a pogrom to erase their financial obligations and seize Jewish property. Papal efforts, such as Clement VI's bulls, Quam vis perfidium, asserting that Jews also died of plague, proved ineffective against local rage and avarice. The Flagellate movement, the Church's failure to halt the plague, eroded public trust in official clergy and fueled the rise of the radical penitential movement known as the Flagellants. Originating in Germany, these groups undertook 33-day processions, symbolizing the years of Christ's life, traveling from town to town. According to Heinrich of Herford, participants wore white robes marked with red crosses and gathered in town squares to whip themselves with flails embedded with iron spikes until they bled profusely, accompanied by hymns and chants. These rituals initially attracted widespread admiration, but gradually transformed into a movement hostile to church hierarchy, prone to violence against clergy, and a catalyst for anti-Jewish attacks. Pope Clement VI condemned the movement as heretical in 1349 and ordered its suppression. Other targets of persecution: lepers and foreigners. In addition to Jews, lepers, beggars, and foreigners became targets of suspicion. Lepers were accused falsely of being immune to plague and intentionally spreading it to the healthy. Memories of the 1321 leper massacres resurfaced, leading to attacks on leprosaria in several regions. Economic metamorphosis, labor scarcity, and the end of feudalism. The most enduring impact of the Black Death was the irreversible transformation it triggered in Europe's economic structure. The sudden demographic collapse reversed the centuries-long condition of labor surplus, creating a severe labor shortage. Rising wages and the golden age of workers. Before the plague, landowners, lords, enjoyed an abundant and inexpensive workforce. After the epidemic, finding peasants to work the fields became extremely difficult. In England, while there was a brief fluctuation in real wages immediately following the plague, subsequent years witnessed increases of up to 87% for unskilled laborers and 27% for skilled workers. For the first time in history, peasants gained bargaining power, leaving their lands to seek better terms from more favorable lords. State intervention, the Statute of Labourers, 1351. The English crown and landed nobility attempted to curb rising wages and the liberation of peasants through strict legislation. The 1351 Statute of Labourers sought to freeze wages at pre-plague 1346 levels and prohibit unauthorized movement of laborers. The law was largely ineffective. Court records provide extensive evidence of its circumvention. Labor poaching. Lords, unwilling to lose their harvests, often paid above the legal wage to hire laborers from neighboring estates. For instance, records show that a laborer named John Death was prosecuted for demanding wages above the legal limit, yet his employer was compelled to hire him. Flight. Peasants fled to towns offering higher wages, rendering enforcement of the law largely futile. Agricultural transformation and the 1381 Peasants' Revolt. Rising labor costs altered agricultural production patterns. The shift from labor-intensive cereal cultivation to sheep farming and pasture-based livestock accelerated. Many villages, the so-called lost medieval villages, were abandoned, and lands were enclosed to create grazing areas. Efforts by the nobility to restore the old order through legal and fiscal measures, such as sumptuary laws and the poll tax, exacerbated social tensions, culminating in the 1381 English Peasants' Revolt, Wat Tyler Rebellion. Although the uprising was suppressed, serfdom effectively ended in England, feudal bonds disintegrated, and a wage-based labor market emerged. Cultural and archaeological reflections. The plague fundamentally transformed perceptions of death and religious rituals. Bioarchaeological evidence. East Smithfield Cemetery. Excavations at East Smithfield and Charterhouse Square in London provide unique insight into the demographic impact of the epidemic. These sites served as emergency burial grounds, where thousands of bodies were interred in orderly rows, sometimes stacked 5 deep, demonstrating an attempt at administrative control amidst chaos. Demographic analysis. Skeletal studies reveal that the plague did not only target the elderly but also healthy adults, though individuals with prior malnutrition or stress markers faced higher mortality. The presence of skeletons of African descent indicates London's demographic diversity in the 14th century and the indiscriminate nature of the epidemic. Artistic reflections, Danse Macabre. The inevitability of death and its leveling of social hierarchies gave rise to the Danse Macabre motif in art. Depictions of skeletal death leading a pope, emperor, noblewoman, and peasant in a communal dance adorned church walls. This iconography served as both a memento mori and a satirical commentary on the futility of wealth and power in the face of mortality. Notable examples include the Cemetery of the Innocents in Paris, 1424, and the Spanish poem Danza General de la Muerte. Conclusion: the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, was not merely a biological catastrophe, but a creative destruction that precipitated the end of the medieval world. Medical paradigm. The inadequacy of ancient authorities became evident. Figures such as Ibn al-Khatib and Guy de Chauliac sowed the seeds of empirical observation and contagion theory. State and society. Through examples like Pistoia and Venice, the state assumed the role of public health guarantor, giving rise to modern quarantine and border control mechanisms. Economic structure. Population collapse rendered labor scarce and valuable, ending serfdom and accelerating the shift from feudalism to wage labor and market-based economic relations. While Europe emerged from this devastation by transforming social and economic structures, paving the way for the Renaissance, rigid polities like the Mamluk Sultanate were unable to recover from demographic and economic shocks for centuries. For survivors, the plague created higher living standards, greater social mobility, and a drive for technological innovation, labor-saving devices, laying the foundations of the modern world. The Black Death officially ended as a major outbreak in 1351, but it continued to resurface for centuries. The plague doctor costume was actually designed for 17th century outbreaks, not in 1347. This catastrophe shows us one crucial lesson. Humanity has the capacity to rebuild itself even after the greatest devastation. It is estimated that between 75 and 200 million people perished, a staggering number, almost unimaginable for the world at that time. Yet from that darkness emerged a new world order, one that broke the chains of feudalism, placed greater trust in science, and recognized the value of labor. Many of the worker rights we enjoy today, as well as modern medical quarantine practices, trace their roots back to those grim years. History is not just about understanding the past. It is a mirror that helps us make sense of the present. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these deep historical analyses, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. See you in the next one.